Okay, so this is the basic setup for writing integration tests. You can see writing all this code is repetitive and time consuming. So what's a faster way? Well, back in the terminal, every time you want to create a component, use Angular CLI to do that. Because Angular CLI will create a basic spec file for writing integration tests for that component. So ng generate component, and now the name of our component. Let's say greeter. So this generates 4 files: a CSS file, an HTML file, a spec file, and the actual component file. Now let's take a look at this spec file. What you see here is very similar to what you saw in the last lecture, but there's a little bit of unnecessary complexity here. So let's see what's happening. So just like the last lecture, we have the declaration of our component and its fixture. However, we have 2 before each blocks. Look, in the first before each block, we configure our testing module, and in the second block, we create the component. So why is it implemented this way? The reason for this is because the components template is in a separate file, and we need to instruct Angular to compile that template as well as the style sheet with the component implementation. So note that here we have a call to the compile components method, and this method is chained to the previous method, configure testing module. So with this, we're telling Angular to compile all the components we have declared here along with their templates and style sheets. Now, because these files are external, Angular needs to access the file system as part of the compilation, and accessing the file system is a little bit slow. That's why compile components method does this asynchronously. And for this very reason, you can see that we have a call to the async function here. So this async function is one of the utility functions defined in Angular. The first time I saw that, I was a little bit confused, but it's actually very simple. Let me show you how it works. So I'm going to use the second before each as an example. So here we're passing a function to the before each, right? Now I'm going to wrap this function with the async function of Angular. So all I do is put async here. This is a function, and it takes another function as an argument. Now this async function will do some magic behind the scene and run this code in an asynchronous zone. And then it will return a standard function that we can pass to the before each. As simple as that. So now let's undo this. Back to the main story. We have 2 before each blocks here because the first one has to be asynchronous because of the call to the compile components method. So once the components are compiled along with their templates and style sheets, then this second before each is called, and at this point we can create an instance of this component. However, in the last lecture, we did not have a call to the compile components method. Why? Because when we use Webpack, Webpack automatically inlines the components template and style sheet in our JavaScript bundle. So the components implementation, as well as its template and style sheet, are all in the same file, in the same JavaScript file. And this means when using Webpack, which is the standard builder when using Angular CLI, we don't really need to call this compile components method. This is really unnecessary. And as you can see, it's adding extra complexity to our test setup. We have 2 before each blocks, and one of them is asynchronous. So I can simply delete this line, cut this code here, and paste it right here in the second before each block, and then get rid of the first one. So this is very similar to what we had in the last lecture. Now, you don't need to make this change every time you generate a component with Angular CLI. You can keep the default generated spec file. So I just wanted you to know how this is different from the code we wrote in the last lecture. Once again, this is unnecessary complexity. You can keep it as is, or if you don't like it, you can make it simpler like what we did in the last lecture. But of course, that requires you to change this every time you generate a component. So it's your personal choice. All right, so we're done with our setup code. In the next lecture, we're going to write our first integration test.